And for those of you who are listening who are really troubled by this conversation,
So are we.
we are, where I'm very troubled by it. Like, since, I mean, I had this kind of moment in 2020 where I was like, wait, what? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Other Armenia's podcast. I am your co-host, Tamar Shirinyan.
And I'm your other co-host, Milena Abrahamian.
So today we are going to have a conversation. It's just going to be Milena and I about peace. There's been a lot of apparently peace in many places. And we thought we would have a conversation about, what is all this peace talk about? Is it peace? What is peace? And just to see, what comes out of it. Of course, we don't really think that there's peace anywhere, but we'll get into that during our conversation. So let's let's start. Where do we want to start?
Well, I think for me, one of the starting points is always like getting to the basics and sort of defining things. I think we are living in a crisis of like sort of what words even mean anymore. And it's so easy to just co-opt certain words. I remember there was like a time that I was constantly saying, like when I first moved back to Armenia, I was constantly saying, let's create our own words, let's create our own vocabulary, like in Armenian also, because I was noticing how, like maybe like 15 years ago, it wasn't so much. It was just sort of getting all of this kind of like West, like knowledge that's produced in the West, which I think is very important, like critical knowledge about like colonialism and like whatever, all these different things, right? Um, Gender, queerness, all of these things were just sort of starting to sort of um, be more people were becoming more aware of here, and there was a lot of translation happening. And I just remember thinking like we don't have to take all of these terminologies, all of these concepts um, from where they're produced, which is like outside of Armenia. We can also kind of try to create our own language. And for me, it was also important to think in terms of how do we stay constantly like on our feet and ahead. So whenever one concept or term gets co-opted, we come up with another one. So we're constantly kind of um, like in exile in language, but like in a good way, where in a way that doesn't allow for the language that comes from our own like experience, that doesn't allow for that language to be taken from, like not taken, but like just basically co-opted. And I remember I still think this way. It's like I think poetry is a great way of doing that. Um, but yeah, so peace, I think when I think about what has been done to peace, it really kind of like breaks my heart because I think it's such an important state of being to be in peace, like on so many levels. And it's kind of bizarre how you can call something peace that is not peace. And like, what are you supposed to do with that? Like, are you supposed to just lie to yourself that, okay, this is peace, but you don't feel like it is, inside you? It feels like violence, but somehow somebody's telling you this is peace. So, yeah.
And I think like that whole like, to say that something is peace when one actually in their own material existence feels that it's not, and sees that it's not. And we see this in many, of of these, contexts in which peace has now, been declared. Probably most horrendously in Gaza. That's supposedly now in peacetime, with a ceasefire deal. But where we see, Palestinians being massacred still daily. And it's almost as if like the declaration of something as peace is a disarmament of oneself. Like, you
Mm,
no longer have to be on guard, and you no longer have to be armed, whether that's actually armed in these cases, in the context of the peace deal with Armenia and Azerbaijan, for example, or in the context of the Gaza ceasefire. There really was a kind of disarming, right? And there's demands that Hamas, for example, disarm, and that Armenia and Azerbaijan now disarm and, work out their differences in some kind of um, civil negotiation. That disarming also happens not just on the state level, but it happens amongst the body politic, right? Like we are supposed to be disarmed. We are no longer supposed to feel like something is, happening that's threatening us, and but we feel very threatened. I mean, in all of these in the United States, right, which is also now being declared as, in many ways war zones, right? The city of Portland, the city of Chicago, Memphis now, near where I live in Tennessee, is also now a war zone, a war-torn city, because of ICE raids and people coming out against ICE raids. Um, and so, in what way, right, is the language of war and peace constantly manipulating a kind of entire political, uh, and also very visceral body politic, to create a kind of like affect amongst the masses that this or this is happening, right? Like, what does it mean to claim that the United States, which is currently not technically at war, is a war zone? And what does it mean to claim that Gaza, which is very much a genocide zone, is actually in a ceasefire peace deal time? Right, yeah. So I think language there does a lot of work, which I think is visceral. It's visceral on like a collective level, right? And we as Americans, I think, are supposed to, and I, I'm in the United States, and I think this is different in Armenia too. Like we as Americans are supposed to feel like, now we can calm down about what's happening in Gaza because it's not happening anymore. When it is still very much happening. And I think in Armenia, it's also, Armenians are supposed to feel like, that war that was going on for 30 years is now over, and so we can now calm down, and has its political implications as well.
I think that it's connected to who the piece is for. That's where it can kind of like, I think it's also like who gets to define peace. So if it's Trump defining peace, to me, that just signals this is a kind of business deal. Like it's peaceful to conduct business. It's the conditions are peaceful enough to conduct business. Now, does that mean that the general population or like the general, like the just regular people that refers, does that mean that this refers to regular people? I don't think so. I think the contrary is that if conditions are peaceful to conduct business that is going to be more detrimental to people's lives, that is going to put people more in debt, that means that less peace for you. It's just sort of spread out. So I think part of why people in the US now can feel like, oh, like, yeah, the issue in Gaza is better now, is maybe because like there's like some kind because of the words that the language that's used, and like maybe it's not like as extreme atrocities all the time. But I haven't been following the news for the past month so much, so maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong in how I understand what's happening. But it does seem to have calmed down in terms of like bombings, in terms of like direct this kind of direct violence, right? Um, and so then it's almost to me like you make the situation so extreme and so violent that when the extreme violence is sort of like gone, then the other violence is somehow like less, and
Yeah.
it's almost like compared to this extreme violence, there's the violence that is still there is no longer violence because you think you've desensitized people. But I think that it's not really possible to desensitize people fully, because I don't think that's how the human organism body really works. I think that always our bodies know more, like are more like quicker to kind of like have more wisdom than our cognitive brain tells us, or whatever like analysis we make. It's like the body is more quick to kind of sense violence than what words can be thrown at us to kind of like, you know, try to convince us that we are living in peacetime. Um,
And I think that that actually is one of the ways in which I would define fascism. And this is something that there's a lot of ways in which we might define fascism, the marriage of the state and the corporate, the defeat of revolutionary potential, and all of these things. Um, I would define fascism as the taking over of material conditions of how one experiences their own reality through ideology, right? So that one actually can no longer experience their own reality anymore. What they actually feel in their body, because there are now ideas that have replaced what are materially felt in the body through one's actual senses of being in the world and seeing what they're seeing. Like it's a mass form of gaslighting, right? You're seeing the reality of what you're seeing, but they are telling you that it's actually something else. And the convincing you through threat and fear and like actual sometimes physical forms of violence for you to believe that on a mass level, right? That I think is really important to our understanding of fascism. And that is, I think, in all of these contexts, what is actually happening, right? Where you have like, for example, I mean, thinking about the Armenia and Azerbaijan peace deal, there's been various there kind of talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan now, and one of them in October was the meeting of a civil society delegation from Azerbaijan who came to Yerevan for a meeting with Armenian civil society actors. And what's that like really shocking about this is that the the amongst the delegates, I mean, who were all like pro-government actors in Azerbaijan, right? So these are all, acting on behalf of the Azerbaijani state. Um, was that amongst them were also people who participated in the blockade of Nagorno-Karabakh, right? And like, how do you under false pretenses, right, claiming that they're eco activists, claiming that they were coming to protect the environment, and blocking people from accessing food and water and medicine and medical services, blocking the entire all the routes to Nagorno-Karabakh that lasted for 10 months, right? The people who are responsible for that, what we might call a humanitarian crisis, what we might also call is like a genocidal violence, are now part of civil society and are part of the peace process the civil society peace process, where civil society in Azerbaijan and Armenia are now meeting and talking. What the hell does that even mean, right? How can you legitimately have peace with bad faith actors? You cannot have peace with bad faith actors, right? There's been a lot, I mean, historically, discussions of transitional justice, like after you have war, civil war, or, conflict amongst different warring parties, how do you then create a condition to get over the war conditions and into peaceful conditions? Most of this has historically failed. And I think part of it is that most of it is actually operated through bad faith acting, right? You have people who are adamant supporters of the war, adamant supporters of the violence, who are now participating in ensuring the peace process. Um,
Well,
if there,
some of those people were also part of peace building projects before the blockade, before the 2020 war. I recognize some of their faces from my own work in the peace building sphere in the region. So it's not like they're totally new. But what I do understand is that um, I was young and maybe a bit naive, but I think that maybe, um, yeah, some of them were acting even back then, obviously back then also, in service of their government, right? So it was never peace. It was just another sphere to influence with the government's sort of like their government's strategic sort of agenda. So it was never about peace, as I understand it, as a kind of building of trust and sort of um, connection, like meaningful connection between the two peoples. It was more about serving the interest of the state, of their state. Um, yeah, and that it makes sense to me that those same people would be the ones blockading and calling it. I mean, it's just so much more like blatantly like direct in that sense than it was back then because it was kind of in a way under the within the it was like mediated processes also, right? So it wasn't direct sort of like Armenians, Azerbaijanis speaking to each other. It was always mediated by, I don't know, European actors for the most part. Um, so there was like a kind of like face you had to keep. And it's just honestly, when I think about it, it's like there's so much performance. It's like, don't people get tired? Don't people just get tired of performing? Like, it's like, why don't you just go and like act in the theater, like, or be in the movies or something? Like, why are you choosing this sphere? But obviously, so much of politics is performance. But yeah, I'm not surprised that these people are serving the interests of their state and using all possible spheres, including and terms, including peace, um, to continue to serve that those interests. It's bizarre to me, like um, just the hypocrisy and like the what's it called? Like it's a cognitive dissonance of sort of we are supposed to have like seeing like in one instance images of like Aliyev and Pashinyan smiling, shaking hands, speaking about peace, and then looking at so many of like the like the internal like how Aliyev speaks internally, right, inside of us to the Azerbaijani people, and sort of speaking about Armenia as Western Azerbaijan, like um, all of the different like there's so much money being poured into kind of like presenting creating a narrative around the history, the culture of Azerbaijan, and like so much of it also focused around Karabakh. I just had some like ad in my phone, like some I don't know like guide, like you have these like tour guides, something where there was a tour to Shushi, which they call Shusha. Um, and I was just looking at the reviews by some Europeans who were like, "Oh yeah, I went on this tour, and like you learn stuff." And it's just like, I'm sorry, like 2 years ago, there was like hundreds of thousands of people being displaced from this lands, like, and throughout the past, I mean, before that as well, there was just so much bloodshed and violence on those lands, and like you're just going there, and like the way it's being like I was looking at some like video of like again a touristic kind of video showing like again sushi as a cultural like there's so much like money being poured into making this propaganda about like sushi as a cultural center of Azerbaijan and um yeah like it's just really like this whitewashing of just what happened just like 2 years ago, and it's just completely like erased. We were talking right before we started about how I was telling you, like, I think some things, because we were talking about the Armenian genocide and like the stories that so many, like, especially writers of Armenian origin went and tried to sort of excavate about their own families and then sort of writing it through novels and stuff, and how I was like troubled by that for so much of my life reading these works because I don't really know any of the stories from my own family. And I feel like there's a reason for that, for like, not raising these issues. And um, I was just telling you, Tamar, that like I feel like some stories it's okay to just not bring up or like to forget. And now I'm like speaking about how I'm so troubled seeing like a story of violence being erased. Um, yeah, I don't know why I went off on a tangent. But
But
if that's what peace is, that's really troubling to me.
And going back to what you were saying earlier, I don't remember if it was in the recording or if it was before we started recording, but talking about peace as the money making. And I think this is really important because, when, for example, when Trump was running for president and he was, at least toward the end, running on a peace platform, right? He was going to bring peace to Ukraine, to Gaza, and none of that has happened, right? He claims, of course, like, and he wanted the Nobel Peace Prize, which he didn't win, another fascist won it instead. And he and many of us were like wondering, what that could possibly mean, right? Like how it could be that, um, you know, Trump and Vance are running on a peace campaign. And the reality is that because this is like a real estate guy, because this is like a fancy resort guy, peace is actually very, lucrative for him in ways that, like, obviously for Dick Cheney, who passed away recently, Dick Cheney was not very happy with peace because he was very much invested in the war machine, right? And so if your
Mm.
money comes from making war, then you want war. If your money comes from times where people are traveling and going to resorts, and war makes all of that really difficult, right? A lot of businesses, right, have been hurt by these wars. A lot of hotels have been hurt by these wars because when a country is in war, people don't travel there as tourists, right? But now that there's peace in these places, right, of course there's the whole Trump plan and all kinds of horrific things for Gaza. But then there's also this corridor now, that's going, the Trump corridor, as it's called, that's going to allow this, movement of Azerbaijanis and Turks to go through, like, between Nakhichevan and Turkey and Azerbaijan. And this is being represented as like this is so good for trade, and it's so good for, global community of coming together and sharing across borders, and of course travel and tourism, right? How wonderful is it that a place that was beleaguered by a frozen conflict for 3 decades, and of course there were like during this so-called peace, frozen conflict for 30 years, there were a lot of especially Armenians who did go to Shushi, who traveled there all the time, a lot of tourism in Qarabağ at the time, but now you can have oil, like you can have oil money invested in these, like, tour guides, and seeing the history there. And now of course the people who were living there 2 years ago are the history of people who are no longer there. What a wonderful thing to be able to sell to tourists.
Yeah. Yeah, it's troubling. It's also troubling to see like one thing that to me, what is again like a kind of like a dissonance to me that just like throws me off, disorients me, is seeing like I don't understand like why um maybe it's a very naive question, but it's like why continue anti-Armenian hate propaganda in Azerbaijan? Because that's like really like institutionalized in the country from what I understand. Obviously, I'm not there, but like from what I understand, like it's part of the education system. I was watching a video like that where was it something added to the curriculum of like showing or like reenacting like the capture of Armenian soldiers in some school in Azerbaijan. And it just felt so just it was just like such a dehumanizing um, reenactment or like just the whole thing was just so dehumanizing. And I'm thinking like, what does that do to like young people who are part of that training and education um, to be in that physical position, to be in that humiliation, to be in that, and it's also very like macho kind of like thing. That's another part of it. And we were talking about like be like losers and not losers before also, and um maybe there's like some fantasy. Like I'm just thinking about it now. Like why would you bring something like that into like an education curriculum? This reenactment of being humiliated and like dehumanized. Like what kind of a fantasy is that? Like it's very interesting. I might say something very controversial, like when I know that after the war, maybe it was like a way of kind of like making ourselves feel better about losing the war, because that's pretty much what happened. Although we can always say that there's no winners in war. Um, in terms of like the loss of life, I absolutely like stand by that. There is no winner in war. Everyone is a loser. In terms of like the political, I guess, reality of it is that there is a loser and there is a winner. um, with loss of lands and loss of livelihoods and that. But um, what was I reflecting on that I forgot? I just forgot my train of thought.
Anti-Armenian rhetoric.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like about this fantasy of, oh yeah, I think after the war, a lot of I was like hearing this a lot in my circles of like, in a way, I guess maybe also sort of trying to justify our position or like feel better about ourselves somehow, where there was some kind of sentiment of like there's something so almost honorable in losing this war. I do remember a sentiment like this, you know? And I'm thinking like, I mean, there is a kind of humility, I guess, that like comes over you, that I think is lacking in the Azerbaijani case and the Azerbaijani society. Maybe like I can sort of see a little bit of or recognize a little bit of this because for 30 years, the Armenian side was the winner, so called, right? Because we were the ones controlling these lands. And so now I can recognize the winner in the other side, which is a very, but still it's a very different thing, I think. I can't really put like make it an equal thing because in that perspective, I guess, of the international um whatever is considered as law or whatever, like the international sort of what is acceptable. Um Karabakh was always sort of was not really was always seen as a part of Azerbaijan, right? Like it was never there was never any sort of um, this kind of institutions or systems or structures that were on the Armenians' side when it comes to this conflict, I would say. I don't know if you agree, but in terms of like the material reality of it, I think like this kind of like performance of on whose side you're on because who's Christian, who's not, like this bullshit that is used or like, you know, to kind of like simplify things, I would say, could be used and to be performed for political gain by France, by Germany, by whoever, right? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like deep down inside, like what these guys, you know, who had power, like really like, you know, to them, like what was clear and true or logical was never that Karabakh is like it's like the Armenians story or way or struggle that is like just somehow or acceptable. Let's put it this way. Like the word acceptable is, I think, more useful to narrate this. And I
You,
think it's sorry, just one last thing. I think it's because internationally this land was always recognized as Azerbaijani, but it's not just because of these instruments that under international sort of standards on paper say that, yeah, this is what makes the most sense. I think it's also that Azerbaijan has oil money, right? So like you want to be on their side, right? So I don't think it's just that some like strict like, oh yeah, we follow the rules. You can't make trouble and want your like you know your what's the word independence. So yeah, if it was in their interest, they would have been okay with Armenians making trouble.
yeah, I think, the Azer Nagorno-Karabakh was militarily occupied by Armenia um, for 30 years. And that's something that I think, Armenians don't like to admit. And, nowhere in Armenian discourse is that part of the conversation. And I remember, I mean, for me, the whole and some of our listeners have asked us to do an episode on Qarabağ, and I think we can do that. The thing is like it's for me and I'll be very honest with this. The question of Qarabağ occupies a very, very fuzzy space for me, um, intellectually and I think emotionally. It's something that if I were to look at it on the face of actual facts, um, it seems to me that there was a lot of fucked up shit that Armenia has done and that Armenians have done in the name of Qarabağ. Um, up until, recently, where now Azerbaijan is doing some pretty extremely fucked up shit in Karabakh. Um, and I mean, for example, right, the renaming of Nagorno-Karabakh as Artsakh, um, as like an ancient name, as a historic name for Armenian territory, in the region, is something that first is an attempt to erase the fact that, um, for many years, right, and for 70 years, under the Soviet Union, and also before that, Karabakh had people who lived on it who were not Armenian. And Karabakh had been for a very long time, right, this place of, I mean, for lack of a better term, multicultural. In fact, there's research dating back, to the Middle Ages, um, that show that, this was always a co-inhabited land by many different peoples. And so to claim it as an ethno state in some ways, which is what the project of the Republic of Artsakh essentially was, right? To claim Karabakh as this is for Armenians and only Armenians, right? Because I, the struggle for Karabakh from the beginning was not for an ethno state. The struggle for Karabakh was for the reunification of Karabakh into the Armenian Socialist Republic. And that's a very different kind of political claim than the claim that this is Armenian land, period, and only Armenians must be on it. That's a very, very different kind of claim. That is ethno-nationalism, right? And so the what we see, and I mean, we in Armenia we talk about Azerbaijanis as the Turk. Colloquially, the Turk is used for Azerbaijanis all the time, which is also new as far as I understand. I've done some oral history interviews with people who lived through the transition years in the war, and many of them, right, talk about how in the Soviet years, they didn't necessarily call Azerbaijanis Turks because there was a lot of cohabitation with Azerbaijanis in Armenia, in Karabakh, and in Azerbaijan.
So what do
Um,
they call them?
they called them Azerbaijanis.
Hmm.
Um, so that whole like move to call Azerbaijanis Turks and to create this kind of this monstrous caricature of both the Ottoman Turk and the Azerbaijani as part of one kind of narrative of genocide and hatred and massacre against Armenians, right? I think is really troubling. This is not to say that in Azerbaijan there were historically no pogroms against Armenians. I mean, there were pogroms against Armenians. There were massacres against Armenians. In Karabakh, in Azerbaijan, and in Nakhichevan. But this isn't. But it's not as if Armenians were totally innocent in this either. And to kind of, you know, um, to take to win a war in 1994, declared through a ceasefire agreement, and to occupy, Nagorno-Karabakh, and to declare that an autonomous republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, and then to also occupy seven territories of Azerbaijan that had nothing to do with Karabakh for security reasons in order to stabilize peace in that region, and to do that for 30 years and expect that this is now the status quo and this is now what we're going to do, and hope that one day eventually Azerbaijan will say, yeah, we accept it. Nagorno-Karabakh is yours, and so are those seven territories of Azerbaijan. You're right. You've been right all along. This is the best way. That is insane. I mean, it is actually insane because we're not here talking about some kind of like, um there is a righteousness to it, right? And
I
this is
think it's,
where like my internal conflict comes from. It
but
is
I think
true that that land the majority of people who lived on that land, including in the Soviet years, were always Armenians. But that doesn't mean that you get to ethnically cleanse everybody else from that territory and claim it as an ethno state. And to
Yeah, I
think
mean,
that the other side is just going to be like one day, okay, you're right,
no,
is
I mean, I agree with you. I think part of the insane of it, of sort of like occupying this lands and these seven territories, part of the insanity of it is not just like this, like that, you just don't do that. That's not nice to do. But part of the like craziness of it is also that like, who do these Armenians think they are to do that? It's like, I think that it's not like it is an actual reality, I think, that we are like we don't have as much power in terms of like the yeah, like we don't have as much power as our neighbor who has oil money and who has connections with Turkey and like just Israel. So I think that's part of the insanity to kind of like to do that. It's not just that like, oh, it's not very nice to do that. But it's also like you're crazy to think you can like maintain this basically. So yeah, obviously like it was never gonna work. And that's why, like, for example, I know one perspective where it was the perspective is like being upset with even this whole Karabakh movement that started in the late 80s and wanting to like making trouble and just kind of like the the idea for this perspective that I'm thinking about would have been to kind of like yeah, like not stir any trouble, which I actually think is a very good tactic and could have worked somehow. I don't know how, but I feel like it's like there feels like something superficial and artificial in how this whole Karabakh movement started, continued, was used by both states to kind of like advance their political like interests internally, right? And it's still being used.
I wanna do a public call here. If there are folks who can actually talk critically about this, who are informed about the history of the Qarabağ movement from a critical perspective that is more complicated than this was a national self-determination movement, period, right? Because it's very clear from the narratives that we've heard that it's far more complicated than that. Um, Please email us, get in touch with us. We would love to have a more nuanced conversation about this topic. And for those of you who are listening who are really troubled by this conversation,
So are we.
we are, where I'm very troubled by it. Like since I mean, I had this kind of moment in 2020 where I was like, wait, what? Like I'm a scholar of like queer politics, right? Like I mean, I like and in Armenia, like where I have many friends, my friends networks and circles are like with artists and queer folks and feminists and so the kinds of questions and the kinds of politics that I've been kind of more clued in on in Armenia were always pretty separated from the Karabakh conflict. Although that and we can talk about that, right? How in peacetime, even before the 2020 war, it was in everything, right? It was a narrative that covered everything in Armenia, which then raises questions about whether this was ever peaceful, if there was ever any peace in regard to the Karabakh conflict. But in 2020, when the Second Karabakh War started, and I was, reading more and trying to understand more about what was going on, I discovered things that no one ever talks about, right? Like
Yes. True.
Armenia had for 30 years occupied seven territories of Karabakh. Now, of course, like that's information that anybody, who studies this knows. It's like a basic fact. I didn't know this, and that's not part of the narrative. That's not part of the national narrative that one would hear in Armenia or even in the diaspora, right? In the diaspora, it's not something that we talk about, that Armenia was actually illegally occupying seven territories of Azerbaijan. Um,
Well, to be fair, that's one like framing of it, which I am back, like I stand behind that framing of it. There is another framing that people could have where we had liberated territories. Like I think that's very problematic. I'm just saying that there might be people who are listening who, might be feeling a certain way about, framing it, especially now, like since we are, I mean, yeah, I think for some people it's a different narrative. And usually I'm more in favor of like having a very like clear position on things and like, saying like I'm here or there. In this case, I know that I am on this like sort of like my position is that yes, like we Armenians were occupying these lands, right? And had ethnically cleansed hundreds of thousands of people from these lands. Um, yeah, and I think it's really important to make a distinction in general as we're having this conversation as well. Just a reminder to ourselves, a reminder to our listeners, at least for my side, and you can say for yourself as well. I generally don't think in terms of like states and state interests and governments and the authority. Like in my mind, I'm thinking about the people always. Like that's what matters to me. So I think about the commonality of the struggle
yeah.
between two peoples. So being going through a struggle that when whether you say that these lands were occupied or liberated, what does that actually mean for the people who were living on those lands, whether they remained on those lands, if we talk about the Armenians, or were exiled from those lands? What does it mean in the aftermath? What does it mean? What does that? It's like these are words we're using. We started with how do we define peace, right? So what does it actually mean? It's not like we can't just throw around and say occupied or liberated without it having history, like there being the reality of violence in that. And as much as like I can understand um, the sort of a more critical perspective on violence to kind of as resistance. I also think that it's not as simple when you have nation states to claim a kind of like freedom fight around lands. I think it's always kind of like uh, like a kind of marriage of like business interests or like economic interests and state whatever like military does, right? And on like taking all of these things into perspective, I'm thinking about if lands are occupied, it means violence for people who are forced to flee. It also means other certain things for the people who are remaining on those
Yes.
lands. Stories of people who are seeing violence, like dehumanization, like from both sides, right? And then how that actually stays with people, how that stays in the body. I'm thinking about women's role, like the reality that women who are, I'm not trying to like essentialize, but because that's just sort of, I think, uh, just a reality that, women weren't the ones in the front lines, which means they were sort of in the home, taking care of the safety of the family, right? What the implications of that are. Like, this is where my mind usually goes. Like, what is happening to the people? What is the experience of the people? and not so much what is the interest and what are the political meanings behind all of these things, as much as those are important. Um, I remember in one of the dialogue meetings I was part of many years ago with young people, right, from Armenia and Azerbaijan, and this was one that was not, I mean, most was mediated, but still having a conversation with an Azeri guy who I didn't know. Like, there's so many things I didn't know either, and just learning about how his own sort of like pain that he had inherited from his father, who was from one of the occupied territories, who couldn't go back to the grave of his father.
Mhm.
And so like now you have the same, where there are graves, and it just seems like a kind of story of the region. It's not just Karabakh. It's also lands that, were, or like sort of these population exchanges that happened, right? Between, like, we were talking to one of our guests who, I
Yeah.
don't think this place that their family is from is Karabakh. It's just Azerbaijan. It's just that there was a
Yeah.
population. But like the pain of, like not being able to go back,
Mhm.
um, the pain of loss, yeah, like all of the implications, like just the human implications of these words that we're using: occupation, peace, war, liberation, whatever. um those are things that are really important to me. And mm, yeah, I also always have this question of, like, also these comparisons that I sometimes make. Like, I'm thinking about Palestinian plot, like, struggle, I'm thinking about the Kurdish struggle, and I'm thinking about how there's differences when have a recognized state, like an internationally recognized nation state, and then all of the different structures and institutionalized ways of, like, having a military, like having all of these bureaucratic things as part of that apparatus. Um, and how can we as Armenians claim some kind of freedom fight? Like, as a nation state in a region where
Yeah.
there's so many geopolitical interests,
Yeah.
and it's like there is no such thing as the interest of the Armenian people. When I think about the people, there is such a thing as the interest of the Armenian state, which is very different from what the interest of the
Yeah.
people would be. I don't necessarily think that nation states are the best uh, model for protecting the interests of the people. I think it's the people that protect the interests of each other, neighbors, I don't know, like communities, families.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I'm just thinking, reflecting from this perspective, and also sort of some of the things that you were saying about what you're conflicted about. I really do think about it, because I also had many opportunities to be in Karabakh and to see and to sort of feel how militarized of a space it is compared to how it felt to be in Armenia
Yeah.
as a body,
Yeah.
and what that means. Also, I always thought about what that means uh, for women,
Yeah.
um, but I also thought about what that means for men and for just the general population. And it's really like a heavy kind of burden to place on regular people when you think about what the military is and what it's the implications of it, where you're supposed to, when you are serving in the military, you're supposed to divorce your civilian identity from your like soldier identity. But imagine you live in a society where there is no such distinction, where you're civilian or not civilian, you're part of the system, so you kind of are constantly, there's a dehumanization that happens when you're asked to sort of serve a military or militaristic purposes. There's a dehumanization always that happens because
And
you're
that's
always expected to kill or to die.
Yeah. And that's part of also the question of liberation, right? Like, I don't mean to completely negate the possibility of a liberatory struggle for Qarabağ. Um, I don't think that that's what it's been, unfortunately. Um, because first, as you're bringing up, right, like one of my friends described Qarabağ, one of my friends who's a journalist described Qarabağ before the 2020 war as basically a very large military base, right? It was a completely militarized society. It had the feeling of being on a military base, and it's incredibly, it was I've never been there. Um, it was an incredibly policed society. We saw this with the case of Asya, the blue-haired girl, who, and I remember that became such a huge story because of like the extreme harassment that she received in Qarabağ just for being, right? Just for being a young woman with blue hair who wasn't attached to a mother and a father while there. She had gone there by herself. Um, and so that that is not a liberated society, right? And honestly, like even if we think about how that is on its way to a liberated society, a militarized society is cannot be on its way to liberation because those are the kinds of values and strictures that are defining everyday life that become the status quo. And liberation can only be from that in my understanding of things. And another, if we think about what liberation of Qarabağ would mean, which is still a question, right? I mean, I think probably, Azerbaijani nationalists would argue and do argue that, Qarabağ has finally been liberated now. But the Qarabağ cannot be liberated until everybody who feels or historically has felt belonging to that land is able to return to it and live peacefully and live a liberated life there. That means without ethnic conflict. That means without the um, the role of developmental states, kind of like violating and penetrating the land for mines, for oil, and for whatever else they might want to do with it. Um, a liberated society would be the multi-ethnic society that Qarabağ historically has been. And one of the things that, we were talking about words and what they mean and how they change the way in which we relate to reality is the concept of borders. And I'm not a utopianist. Like I don't believe in some kind of utopia where there is no, you know, I mean, I think we can definitely have a world without borders because I know humans have for more year for more millennia than not have lived in worlds without borders, right? Borders are very new, and so for certain we can have worlds without borders. Um, but the way in which we even understand, right? This is Azerbaijan, this is Karabakh, this is Nakhchivan, this is Armenia, and all of those kinds of demarcations is a result of the very concept of the nation state. But these lands have been occupied and lived in far before the configuration of the nation state. Like even if we go back, I was reading Ronald Sunni's book on the Baku Commune, and I'm, hoping that maybe he'll agree to come on an episode with us. But I mean, aside from the whole labor history and the history of the revolution in Baku, what I like just found really fascinating is the way in which there were so many peoples who lived there, in this area, in the South Caucasus. And inhabited, I mean, of course there were always like class stratifications amongst different groups, different migratory patterns, different reasons why people were there, some of whom were there for labor. But this is such a rich place in the world, Right? I mean, in many ways, right? The Caucasus is like the cradle of civilization. It's where so much of history and movement in the world very much began. And it's really sad that now the narrative of liberation is to make it either one ethno-state or another ethno-state. And that is vile, and it is violent.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. I think, first of all, this is a very funky region of the world in terms of like all the different types of like um peoples that you would find here that you would have never heard of before. Like, um, I do think, honestly, I think it's important to sort of. I know that this is the narrative. This is a narrative that like yeah, like maybe like more nationalist Armenians have about Armenians in the region. Um, and it's like, I'm thinking about how I want to relate to this. Um, and I also still, just from my own experience in this region, um, living in different places, as many different places as possible, because there's a border I can't cross with Azerbaijan, obviously. But I do think it's important to bring up the question of Armenophobia in the region. And I think this is something we can't really like say, we cannot like equalize and say, well, Armenians are also like hating on Azeris, or Armenians are also hating on Turks, Armenians are also hating on Georgians. I think it's a very different hating on these people that comes from like maybe like, I'm not justifying it. Like, I don't think it's okay to hate on anybody, right? But I think that Armenophobia, like, it's like a very specific phenomenon that is very specific to this region. And I'm not saying Armenophobia can sort of travels to, I don't know, your part of the world, and just like can be there, can live there. Because like who knows who Armenians even are for there to even exist Armenophobia in Knoxville, right? But in this region, because we are known, like people know us, who we are who Armenians are, and there is like I think you can't like genocide a people if you love them. You genocide a people because you hate them, because there's hate. So that's part of like just like hating a very specific group of people, right? So I think that's something that is part of the region. Even let's say in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, maybe it started in the Ottoman Empire, but there's a lot of groups in the region who were influenced by the Ottoman Empire. I remember being like in Bulgaria, in Sofia, like many years ago, in a taxi, asking the taxi driver, oh, like, yeah, you have Armenians here, historically they know who Armenians are. um and I was curious like what he thought, or what Bulgarians thought of Armenians. And there's this like very stereotypical way like that he perceives Armenians, and yeah, like I just think it's like um yeah, like there's something unique um or some specificity about being Armenian in this region that I think comes with a kind of dislike, yeah, or like some type of feeling around who these
Hmm.
people are, right? And I don't want to ignore that as, or avoid that as part of the equation. And for me, like, yeah, it's as much as I don't agree with this, and I don't, because I don't generally agree with like militarization, with nationalism, with nation states. I can understand like where wanting to put this narrative of, oh, liberation, like army, like let's liberate ourselves, like comes from. But I don't really think that it's in the right, I don't know, like I think that we have deeper reflection to do as a people that is part of peoples of the region. Let's put it
Hmm.
this way. Um, so that we're more like I think maybe there's a fear of sort of like being but there's a fear of like inviting. I mean, there's a whole like fear around opening borders, right? Like there is this part of the narrative for Armenians in Armenia that like let's stay secluded, it will protect us from like becoming like eliminated or culturally even or whatever. But I think that's a false belief. I think in for ourselves, I think rooted in fear because I think Armenians have mostly been like more of like this than
Yeah.
this, you know? So it's like, what is it? Like, why are you succumbing to these, yeah, like lies, fears? Why are you succumbing to these fears, thinking that you will be no more
But I
instead
don't
of,
know. Like, I mean, I think that there's some realities to those fears. There's realities to the threat on Armenian sovereignty. We see this very clearly with the so-called Trump corridor, the peace corridor, um, and the way in which you have this third party state, this massive imperial state, the largest imperial state on the planet, administering the border of Armenia now as a result of this route that's supposed to connect Azerbaijan to the larger region. And there, I think there's a serious loss of sovereignty, the loss of the ability to govern one's own borders. Armenia can basically no longer has full access to govern its own border with Iran, which has for a long time been an ally of Armenia, which is really problematic. Um, I also think that, after the 2020 war and these conversations of like coexistence, like I just want to say that I'm not like naive and think that like, oh, let's just all coexist and it'll be fine, right? Because the reality is that, right, we're not dealing with equal parties here. We are dealing with states, which makes this conflict very different than like the Kurdish question or the Palestinian question, for example, because we're talking about stateless peoples who essentially on an international playing field have zero power against massive one, Turkey being a NATO power and Israel being like fucking, the proxy of the largest empire on the planet. So, one of the things that I was thinking about a lot after the Second Karabakh War in 2020 was like, how could how could there be coexistence in Syria? Like, what if like Karabakh were opened up and everybody who was evicted from that land in the 1980s and 1990s were allowed to just come back, right? And there were, land distribution projects, some kind of transitional justice, right? Where Azerbaijanis were not completely excluded from that territory. But you can see how quickly, right, a more powerful state is going to use that as a way to settle that territory and take it over and make it an ethno state eventually, right? Because it is a more powerful state. And so I can see like our Armenian hesitation of, you know, like not wanting to be totally open in the region because that could present some serious problems in maintaining sovereignty. Um, but I do ultimately believe in, you know, liberation of people from their states.
yeah, I also do see like why there's this yeah, like the fear around, you know, opening up, I guess. Um, it's just for me like the fear there is not so much about losing some kind of like Armenian identity, but it's like more like losing humanity in a way because that opening is always about markets. It's always about economic and
Yeah.
financial interests. It's always about, honestly, like making life a bit miserable. And that is an issue of all peoples. It has nothing to do with, Armenianness or not Armenianness. To me, it's like,
Yeah.
I don't think that, yeah, it's so much about like this kind of ethnic identity. I think it's more about human identity, like being able to continue to kind of live um like uh, livable lives. I don't know how to name it, like lives that feel dignified, or I don't know what word to use, but just
Yeah. And I think that's peace, right? Like before we started recording today, you were telling me about like your mom, describing, what is like what is
a good life.
a good life,
Yeah.
right? And it's like the good life is not living paycheck to paycheck, month to month, like living in a way where you're not afraid that in 3 or 4 days you're not going to have anything to live on. You're not going to be able to pay for food, for a place to live, and for having access to healthcare and all of those things that we need, or having some comforts in life too. I think that that is also peace, to have some comforts, to not just be like bare life, like surviving, right? But
Yeah.
to have I mean, not necessarily material things, but safety and stability and comfort, right? And I would say that that's exactly what, there's a saying, thinking, war is politics by other means, right? So if you can't do politics, if you can't kind of negotiate something politically, which, maybe we mean civilly, then you go to war. War is basically to impose some kind of politics on another that they refuse to negotiate. And I would say that like politics is war by other means, right? Because that's like when we're talking about the peace times in between these wars, it's also like, bare life and survival for people.
Yeah.
And life is being made amidst, there is no peace, right? Put the tanks and the drones and all of that aside, right? There is no peace. People are all over the world struggling immensely just to be able to not die,
Yeah.
right? And we can't have peace until we have liberation from those conditions.
Maybe that's a good um point to end on. A bit more positive, I guess. Ah.
Yeah. Yeah,
But this is a conversation that I think, yeah, like can go on, can continue.
yeah. And we'll think about other ways to extend it into other episodes, because I think these are things that we really have to talk about. And these are the most controversial things. And I, may have been incorrect. Again, like I've said, I I don't know what my position is on this question because it's so fuzzy and it's so difficult for me. So please do comment if you have ideas, if you have thoughts. Please be constructive and
Yeah,
not,
engage in conversation with us. Like
yeah,
you can see how we're sort of like trying to like figure this out together, and it would be even better to figure it out with more people. So please add to the conversation by commenting, and of course, as always, liking, following, subscribing on Spotify, on YouTube.
yes, do
And
all
thank
of
you
those.
for, yes. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you. And we'll see you all next time. Bye.
Bye bye.